The Nexus Station's diplomatic quarter hummed with the kind of civilized violence that only truly advanced societies could perfect. Here, in the gleaming chrome and crystal halls where 12 major galactic civilizations gathered every quarter, disputes over mining rights, trade routes, and territorial boundaries were settled through what the bureaucrats politely termed frontier challenges. The rest of the galaxy knew them by their more honest name, sanctioned blood sport with paperwork. It was, the station's promotional materials claimed, a tradition dating back 3 millennia, a refined evolution from the crude days when species simply obliterated each other's homeworlds over resource disagreements. Now they obliterated each other's champions instead, which was apparently progress. The victor's government got the disputed territory, the loser got a very official condolence certificate, and everyone got to maintain the comfortable fiction that civilization had moved beyond simple barbarism. The viewing galleries buzzed with anticipation as representatives from across the galaxy settled into their species-appropriate seating arrangements. The crystalline Vorthok delegation occupied the high-energy spectrum booths, their translucent bodies refracting the station's lights into dazzling aurora displays. Masters of energy manipulation, they could reshape matter at the molecular level, and had once powered an entire star system by accident during a particularly enthusiastic celebration. Their champion, a towering construct of living diamond and contained plasma, stood motionless in the preparation chamber, occasionally shifting form from humanoid to abstract geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Below them, the insectoid Zephyrians clustered in their communal pods, thousands of individual minds linked in perfect hive consciousness. Their chittering conversations occurred at frequencies that made the station's translation systems emit small puffs of smoke from overwork. The Zephyrian champion was less an individual than a mobile command center. 6 meters of articulated carapace housing enough tactical processing power to coordinate a fleet engagement, while simultaneously calculating the optimal trajectory for 17 different projectile weapons. The gaseous Nethrim delegation existed primarily in specialized containment fields, their semi-corporeal forms shifting through colors that most species couldn't perceive, and several that actively violated local physics ordinances. Psychic powerhouses who could influence matter through sheer force of collective will, they found physical combat distastefully primitive. Their champion was a compromise, a solid-state projection of pure psionic energy wrapped around just enough matter to qualify as technically corporeal. It spent most of its time in meditation, occasionally causing nearby electronics to experience what could charitably be called temporary enlightenment. The other delegations represented equally impressive examples of galactic evolution. The mechanical Corellians had transcended biological limitations through cybernetic enhancement, until the line between organism and machine became a philosophical debate rather than a practical distinction. The aquatic Hydrazons had developed technology that functioned equally well in vacuum or ocean depths. The silicon-based Patrons thought in geological timescales, and considered anything happening faster than continental drift to be unseemly hate. Each species had brought their finest warrior genetically optimized, technologically augmented, and trained from birth in the art of representing their civilization's superiority through creative violence. The betting pools had been active for weeks with odds carefully calculated based on previous performance, technological advantages, and the complex web of diplomatic alliances that determined which species were currently speaking to which others. Then the human representative walked in. The collective reaction was immediate, and frankly insulting. The Vorthok delegation's aurora patterns shifted to what their translation systems helpfully identified as confused amusement. The Zephyrian hive-mind produced a sound like 10,000 insects, trying not to laugh simultaneously. Even the usually dignified Nethrim allowed their containment fields to flicker in what passed for polite snickering among energy beings. She was, by any galactic standard, aggressively unremarkable. Average height by human standards, which made her barely waist-high to most of the assembled champions. She wore a basic environmental suit of the type that human freight workers used for routine maintenance. Nothing approaching the sophisticated combat armor favored by serious warriors. No visible weapons beyond what appeared to be a standard emergency toolkit, no obvious cybernetic enhancements, genetic modifications, or exotic technology integration. She walked directly to the registration console with the kind of casual confidence usually reserved for beings who could rearrange matter at will, or existed partially outside normal spacetime. The console's holographic interface flickered through several dozen language options before settling on standard Galactic, apparently having failed to detect any of the usual biological or technological augmentations that would indicate a proper champion. The Corellian delegate, a being whose consciousness existed distributed across 17 separate processing cores, actually accessed the station's database to verify that humans had in fact been properly invited to participate. They had, though, apparently through what the records diplomatically termed an administrative oversight in the qualification protocols. As she completed her registration, the betting pools exploded into activity. The odds on the humans surviving the first round opened at roughly the same probability as the station's central star spontaneously deciding to become a nice cup of tea. The Zephyrian hive-mind immediately calculated 47 distinct scenarios for her elimination, then added 3 more just to be thorough. The Vorthok began taking bets on whether she would last long enough for the arena's environmental systems to finish their startup cycle. The human calmly reviewed the tournament bracket displayed on the central hologram, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was being discussed in terms usually reserved for particularly entertaining forms of cosmic background radiation. She nodded once, as if confirming something to herself, then walked toward the preparation chambers with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had somewhere important to be. Behind her, the galaxy's finest civilizations continued their calculation, secure in the knowledge that they were about to witness either the shortest combat trial in recorded history, or the most spectacular failure of the qualification protocols, since the incident with the sentient furniture 3 centuries prior. They were, as it turned out, spectacular in their own failure to understand what they were actually about to witness. But then the galaxy had always underestimated the species that had somehow stumbled into space travel, despite lacking any obvious qualifications for survival beyond an inexplicable refusal to accept that anything was impossible. The arena materialized around the combatants like a fever dream designed by committee. Nexus Station's pride and joy, the adaptive combat environment, was a masterpiece of holographic engineering capable of recreating any planetary condition known to galactic science. Every few minutes, the battlefield would shift between environments: methane swamps of the Outer Rim, the crystalline gravity wells of the Vorthok homeworld, zero-atmosphere asteroid fields where physics went to die, radiation-soaked wastelands that glowed with the cheerful luminescence of a dozen different ways to develop interesting new cancers. The viewing galleries had filled to capacity, with overflow crowds watching through the station's entertainment network. Concession stands reported record sales of what passed for popcorn among beings whose digestive systems ranged from photosynthetic to purely theoretical. The Hydrazons had set up elaborate betting pools that somehow involved probability mathematics and synchronized swimming. Even the normally reserved Patrons were displaying what counted as excitement when your natural lifespan was measured in geological epochs. The tournament bracket had been mercifully streamlined. Single elimination, 12 champions, 3 rounds to determine who got to claim the disputed Kepler sectors. A cluster of mineral-rich systems that had been causing diplomatic incidents for the better part of a decade. The human had drawn the Vorthok champion for her opening match, which the collective wisdom of the galaxy considered roughly equivalent to scheduling a philosophical debate between a photon and a small asteroid. The Vorthok warrior entered the arena like controlled lightning given purpose and a really impressive light show. Standing 3 meters tall in its default configuration, the being's crystalline body shifted through geometric forms that made advanced mathematics look pedestrian. Spectral analysis indicated it was composed of at least 14 different exotic materials, 3 of which weren't supposed to exist outside laboratory conditions, and one that periodically forgot to obey conservation of energy laws. As the arena's first environment, a standard terrestrial forest setting snapped into existence around them. The Vorthok immediately began demonstrating why their species had conquered 17 star systems through applications of applied physics, that made other civilizations weep with envy. Its left arm extended into a blade of pure coherent energy that could slice through molecular bonds while simultaneously existing in 7 dimensions. The right arm became a projection array capable of reorganizing matter at the subatomic level. Just standing there, it was casually violating enough physical laws to make the arena's safety systems file formal complaints with the station's legal department. The human stood approximately 15 meters away, looking like someone who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood and was politely waiting for direction. Her environmental suit's heads-up display was cycling through what appeared to be diagnostic information, though whether she was analyzing her opponent or simply checking her oxygen levels remained unclear to the increasingly bemused spectator. The match began with what the Vorthok probably considered a merciful, quick elimination attempt. Coherent energy lances struck the ground where the human had been standing, converting several cubic meters of simulated soil into exotic plasma states that glowed with colors for which most languages lacked appropriate adjectives. The human was no longer there, having moved with the kind of urgent efficiency typically associated with beings who had suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. For the next several minutes, the galaxy was treated to what could generously be described as the most one-sided chase sequence in recorded combat history. The Vorthok warrior deployed increasingly spectacular attacks, gravity manipulation fields, localized space-time distortion, energy constructs that existed partially in pocket dimensions, while the human engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate game of 3-dimensional tag in which only one player was aware of the rule. The betting pools shifted moment by moment, as spectators tried to calculate exactly how long the human could maintain her frantic evasion pattern. The Zephyrian hive-mind updated their elimination scenarios in real time, though they had apparently run out of conventional predictions, and were now including possibilities involving spontaneous evolution, temporal paradoxes, and the arena achieving sentience and declaring independence from the station. The Corellian delegation began analyzing the human's movement patterns with the kind of computational intensity usually reserved for calculating hyperspace jump coordinates. Their distributed consciousness noted something peculiar. The seemingly random evasions weren't actually random at all. There was a pattern, though it appeared to be based on factors that had nothing to do with the Vorthok's attacks. Then the arena shifted. The forest environment dissolved, replaced by the radioactive hellscape of a Class 7 contamination zone. The kind of place where atomic particles went to develop personality disorders, and electromagnetic radiation achieved consciousness briefly before dying of existential dread. Emergency containment fields activated automatically as the arena's safety systems detected energy levels that would make most starship reactors file for early retirement. The Vorthok warrior's crystalline form immediately began adapting, its exotic matter composition shifting to accommodate the hostile environment. Energy absorption increased, defensive matrix reconfigured, spectral output adjusted to maintain combat effectiveness in conditions that would sterilize most known life forms. The human reached up and removed her helmet. The collective intake of breath from 12 different species created a minor atmospheric disturbance in the viewing galleries. Several hydrozans actually stopped breathing entirely, which for aquatic beings required considerable commitment. The Nethrim's containment fields flickered with what their translation systems identified as profound philosophical confusion. She was breathing the radioactive atmosphere, not just surviving it, breathing it like it was a particularly pleasant spring morning on whatever death world had produced her species. Her environmental suit's radiation detectors were displaying readings that should have been accompanied by funeral arrangements, yet she appeared completely unaffected. The Vorthok warrior, meanwhile, was beginning to experience what could charitably be termed performance issue. Its exotic matter composition, so perfectly adapted for energy manipulation, was proving vulnerable to the specific radiation cocktail now filling the arena. Molecular bonds were becoming unstable. Quantum coherence was developing a noticeable stutter. The being that had entered the arena as controlled lightning was gradually becoming uncontrolled static. The human walked calmly across the glowing wasteland, and politely tapped the increasingly discorporeal Vorthok on what remained of its shoulder. The gesture was recognized by the arena's combat systems as a formal yield request, which the Vorthok warrior accepted with what its translator helpfully identified as confused gratitude. As the arena returned to neutral configuration, and medical teams rushed to stabilize the radiation-poisoned crystal being, the viewing galleries fell into the kind of silence usually associated with massive gravitational anomalies, or the moment when everyone simultaneously realizes they've been making the same fundamental error in judgment for several consecutive centuries. The human collected her victory confirmation, put her helmet back on, and walked toward the preparation chambers for the next round. Behind her, the galaxy's finest civilizations frantically began recalculating their assumptions about a species that apparently considered radioactive hellscapes to be breathable atmosphere, and had somehow weaponized the concept of environmental adaptation. The betting pools meanwhile experienced what could only be described as a complete existential crisis, and temporarily shut down for emergency recalibration. The second round drew a crowd that included representatives from species who hadn't attended a frontier challenge in centuries, apparently summoned by reports that defied both statistical probability and several fundamental assumptions about how reality was supposed to function. The station's entertainment network was experiencing the kind of viewership spike usually associated with stellar catastrophes, or the discovery of new forms of exotic matter that violated causality in entertaining ways. The human's next opponent was a Zephyrian champion, whose individual components had been selected from the finest tactical minds of a civilization that thought in perfect unison. The creature implied a singularity that didn't quite capture the reality of 47 organisms functioning as a single military intelligence, entered the arena like a mobile war college, wrapped in chitinous armor and armed with enough processing power to calculate the optimal solution to most military conflicts before they actually began. The Zephyrian hive-mind had spent the intermission period analyzing every recorded second of the human's previous match, cross-referencing her movement patterns against 17,000 different combat scenarios, and consulting tactical databases spanning 3 millennia of interspecies warfare. Their conclusion, shared simultaneously across 47 interconnected consciousness nodes, was that the human's victory had been a statistical anomaly, environmental luck combined with species-specific radiation tolerance, that wouldn't apply to opponents who hadn't evolved on worlds where the local star periodically attempted genocide through creative applications of particle physics. The arena materialized into a urban combat environment, complete with multi-level structures, variable gravity zones, and enough tactical complexity to make military academies across the galaxy update their curricula in real time. The Zephyrian champion immediately began deploying predictive algorithms, calculating optimal attack vectors, defensive positions, and contingency strategies for every possible combination of variables the environment provided. The human walked directly into what any tactical analysis would identify as an obvious trap. The Zephyrian collective consciousness experienced something unprecedented in their species' history: confusion. Not the temporary disorientation that came from processing too many data streams simultaneously, but fundamental bewilderment at encountering behavior that defied logical analysis. The human was moving through the urban environment in patterns that made no tactical sense, exposing herself to attack vectors, ignoring superior defensive positions, making strategic choices that seemed actively designed to maximize her vulnerability. The collective tried to compensate by expanding their predictive models, incorporating variables for irrational behavior, psychological warfare, and the possibility that the human was implementing some form of deep strategy deception. The result was a decision tree so complex it began generating its own branch of mathematics and briefly achieved sentience, before being forcibly shut down by the hive-mind's quality control protocols. Meanwhile, the human continued her apparently suicidal advance through the arena, occasionally pausing to examine irrelevant environmental details with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for artifacts of profound archaeological significance. She spent 30 seconds studying the texture pattern on a simulated wall. She collected a small piece of debris that served no obvious tactical purpose. She even stopped to observe the arena's holographic wildlife, a detail so minor that most combatants never noticed its existence. The Zephyrian champion, its collective consciousness now devoting approximately 60% of its processing power to the increasingly futile task of predicting the human's next move, began making tactical errors, small ones at first, positioning mistakes,
resource allocation and efficiency, timing miscalculations that wouldn't have occurred if the hive mind wasn't spending so much computational capacity trying to solve the logical impossibility of an opponent who seemed actively committed to making terrible decisions. The turning point came when the humans suddenly reversed direction and began moving through the environment in patterns that were somehow even more tactically nonsensical than her previous approach. The Zephyrian Collective, now dedicating 85% of its consciousness to predictive analysis, began experiencing what could charitably be described as a distributed nervous breakdown. Individual nodes started reporting conflicting tactical assessments. Coordination protocols began failing as different segments of the hive mind reached mutually exclusive conclusions about optimal strategy. The perfect unity that had made the Zephyrians masters of collective warfare began fragmenting into chaos as the collective consciousness encountered an opponent whose behavior couldn't be processed by minds that had evolved to think as one. The human walked up to the now paralyzed Zephyrian champion and politely tapped it on what appeared to be its primary sensory cluster. Combat systems registered the yield, and medical teams rushed to treat what the station's xenobiologists diplomatically classified as acute cognitive dissonance, resulting from exposure to incomprehensible tactical doctrine. Round 3 brought the gaseous Nethrim champion, whose psychic capabilities had once convinced an entire solar system to voluntarily relocate because its orbital patterns were aesthetically displeasing. The being manifested as a controlled aurora of pure thought, given semi-physical form, wrapped around just enough matter to satisfy the tournament's technical requirements for corporeal participation. The arena became a maze of crystalline formations that amplified psychic resonance, creating the perfect environment for mental manipulation, emotional influence, and the kind of telepathic warfare that made other species install mental firewalls and pray to whatever deities specialized in protecting consciousness from unauthorized access. The Nethrim champion immediately began probing the humans' mental defenses, expecting to find the usual collection of fears, desires, tactical concerns and survival instincts that could be manipulated, amplified, or turned against their owner. What it discovered instead was the psychological equivalent of trying to read a book written in a language that changed alphabets every few sentences while simultaneously existing in multiple dimensions. The human mind, it turned out, was a remarkably chaotic place. Thoughts moved in patterns that seemed designed by someone who had heard a description of logic once, but hadn't paid particularly close attention. Emotional responses followed no predictable sequence. Memory storage appeared to be organized according to principles that violated several fundamental assumptions about how consciousness was supposed to function. Worse, the humans seemed to be actively cultivating this mental chaos. Where most species had evolved sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms, mental barriers, cognitive firewalls, consciousness partitioning, the human had apparently decided that the best defense against psychic intrusion was to maintain a mind so inherently disorganized that telepathic contact was like trying to read a library during an earthquake while the books were on fire, and the librarians were having an existential crisis. The Nethrim champion, a being whose consciousness existed primarily as pure organized thought, found itself trapped in telepathic contact, with a mind that seemed to operate on the principle that order was more of a suggestion than a requirement. After several minutes of increasing psychological distress, it formally withdrew from the human's consciousness and immediately requested emergency meditation time to restore its sanity. The yield came when the human, apparently oblivious to the profound psychic battle that had just occurred, asked if the glowing aurora being was feeling all right and offered to share her emergency rations, in case low blood sugar was causing the cosmic entity's obvious distress. As the third consecutive opponent was carried away by medical teams, this time for treatment of what the Nethrim delegation described as temporary philosophical vertigo, the viewing galleries fell into a silence that had moved well beyond confusion, and was approaching the kind of existential contemplation usually reserved for encounters with cosmic horror or really effective tax policy. The betting pools, having experienced complete systemic failure after the second match, had been replaced by what the station's economists were calling speculative philosophy markets, where beings could wager on increasingly abstract concepts, like whether reality was functioning properly, or if the tournament had accidentally crossed into a parallel dimension, where cause and effect were more of a hobby than a natural law. The human, meanwhile, collected her third victory confirmation and headed toward the preparation chambers for the final round, leaving behind a galaxy that was beginning to suspect it had fundamentally misunderstood something important about the universe, though exactly what remained frustratingly unclear. The championship round had attracted what could conservatively be described as the attention of everyone in the galaxy who possessed sufficient consciousness to experience curiosity. Emergency viewing platforms had been constructed around Nexus Station to accommodate delegations from species who hadn't communicated with the rest of civilization since the invention of faster-than-light travel. Ancient beings who normally spent their time contemplating the heat, death of the universe had temporarily postponed their cosmic meditations to observe what was either the most significant upset in competitive combat history, or evidence that reality had developed a sense of humor and was sharing the joke with anyone willing to pay attention. The humans' final opponent was the tournament's defending champion, a Corellian war construct, whose 7 consecutive victories had established it as the closest thing the galaxy possessed to a perfect fusion of biological evolution and technological transcendence. Standing 4 meters tall and incorporating the finest achievements of a civilization that had spent millennia optimizing the art of creative violence, the being represented everything the galaxy understood about combat effectiveness. Its skeletal structure was composed of self-repairing metamaterials that could adapt their molecular configuration in real time. Synthetic muscle fibers provided strength that could crush starship hulls while maintaining the precision necessary to perform microsurgery on quantum particles. Cybernetic enhancement nodes distributed throughout its body monitored environmental conditions, analyzed opponent behavior, and calculated optimal response strategies with processing power that made most planetary computer networks seem quaint. The arena materialized in what the technical specifications described as random chaos mode, an environment that shifted between every possible planetary condition in the galaxy's database, with no predictable pattern or transition period. Gravitational fields fluctuated from crushing weight to 0 g in seconds. Atmospheric composition changed from methane swamps to chlorine storms to vacuum to pressures that could compress carbon into diamond. Temperature variations ranged from stellar core intensity to absolute zero, often simultaneously in different sections of the battlefield. It was, the arena designers had proudly noted, the ultimate test of adaptability, an environment so hostile and unpredictable that survival required the kind of technological sophistication that only the galaxy's most advanced civilizations could provide. The Corellian champion had been specifically designed for exactly this scenario, its adaptive systems capable of reconfiguring for any conceivable environmental challenge, faster than most beings could process the change. The match began with the Corellian demonstrating why it had remained undefeated for 7 years. As the arena shifted from Arctic wasteland to volcanic hellscape to underwater cavern system, the war construct's form flowed seamlessly between configurations: thermal regulation system, pressure adaptation protocols, respiratory modifications that allowed it to process any atmospheric composition the arena could generate. It was watching the galaxy's finest engineering achievement perform exactly as intended, with the kind of flawless efficiency that made other species question whether biological evolution had been a cosmic mistake. The human, meanwhile, was engaging in what had become her signature combat technique: creative survival through methods that defied conventional tactical analysis. She moved through the chaos with the same purposeful uncertainty that had characterized her previous victories, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was facing an opponent specifically designed to excel in exactly these conditions. For the first several minutes, the contest proceeded exactly as Galactic conventional wisdom predicted. The Corellian's superior technology, enhanced biology, and adaptive capabilities allowed it to dominate the battlefield, while the human engaged in increasingly desperate evasion patterns. The viewing galleries began to relax, comfortable in the familiar narrative of technological superiority, asserting itself over whatever inexplicable anomaly had carried the human through the preliminary round.
Then the pattern began to emerge. visible first to the most analytically sophisticated observers and gradually spreading through the collective consciousness of 12 civilizations. As they witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about combat, adaptation, and the nature of intelligence itself. The human wasn't just surviving the environmental chaos, she was using it. Every seemingly random movement, every apparently panicked evasion, every tactical decision that appeared to violate basic survival instincts, was actually positioning her to exploit the arena's unpredictable transitions. When the Corellian adapted its respiratory system for a methane atmosphere, she maneuvered the fight toward a section that was about to shift to vacuum. When its thermal regulation optimized for Arctic conditions, she led it into a zone preparing to become a plasma storm. The Corellians perfected adaptive systems designed to respond optimally to any environmental challenge, became a liability when facing an opponent who understood that optimization was just another word for predictability. Each adaptation created a temporary vulnerability, a moment of specialized configuration that could be exploited if someone was willing to embrace chaos rather than fight it. The final sequence unfolded with the kind of elegant inevitability that made witnesses wonder if they were observing combat, or witnessing the universe demonstrate a particularly sophisticated joke about the nature of perfection. The human maneuvered the Corellian into a section of the arena that was cycling rapidly between extreme environmental conditions, the kind of chaotic transition zone that the war construct systems were designed to navigate through rapid adaptive responses. Instead of avoiding the chaos, the human began amplifying it. Her movements, seemingly random but actually precisely calculated, created feedback loops that forced the Corellian's adaptive systems into increasingly rapid reconfiguration cycles. Optimization protocols began interfering with each other as the war construct attempted to adapt to conditions that were changing faster than its sophisticated systems could process. The end came when the human triggered what could only be described as an adaptive cascade failure. The Corellian systems, pushed beyond their operational parameters by the need to continuously reconfigure for contradictory environmental demands, began competing with each other for resources and processing priority. Cybernetic enhancement nodes started optimizing for mutually exclusive conditions simultaneously. Synthetic muscle fibers received conflicting adaptation commands and began working against each other. The galaxy's most perfect warrior collapsed, not from physical damage or technological failure, but from being too perfectly adapted to handle an opponent who had weaponized imperfection itself. The silence that followed lasted approximately 17 seconds, during which time several species experienced what their philosophers would later classify as enlightenment, nervous breakdown, or both simultaneous. The human walked calmly across the deactivated arena, collected her territorial claim documents from the stunned tournament officials, and headed toward the exit with the same purposeful stride that had carried her through 4 impossible victories. She never provided her name to the official records. She never explained her methods to the increasingly desperate xenobiologists who requested interviews. She simply completed the administrative paperwork necessary to claim the Kepler sectors for human colonization and departed Nexus Station aboard a cargo transport whose technical specifications would have embarrassed most species museum pieces. Behind her, the galaxy struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. The greatest military minds, the most sophisticated tactical analysis systems, and the combined wisdom of 12 ancient civilizations, had been defeated not by superior technology or enhanced biology, but by something far more disturbing, the recognition that their evolutionary advantages were also evolutionary limitations, and that perfection was just another word for brittleness when confronted with a species that had apparently evolved to thrive in chaos. The final tournament report, when they were eventually completed, contained a single observation that would reshape galactic military doctrine for the next 3 centuries. The humans had won not because they were stronger, faster, or more technologically advanced, but because they were the only species in the galaxy that had never forgotten how to be truly creatively impossibly adaptive. They had laughed when she walked in alone. They were silent when she walked out victorious, and they would remain silent for a very long time, contemplating the uncomfortable realization that they had just been taught a lesson about survival by a species that somehow made chaos look like strategy and called it evolution.